Hey folks, so let's talk about this business of generational karma, a framework for understanding and comprehending generational karma. And so when we talk about generational karma, we would, in basic terms, be referring to, let's say, the imprints of consciousness, the energetic imprints and patterns of consciousness that are held within your genetic line, your family line. And so you would come into a family very intentionally with very great purpose for your incarnating into a specific genetic line. And so your genes, your genetic inheritance is not just a physical thing, meaning, well, you inherit the eyes or the hair or the nose of your grandparents or ancestors that you've not met. You don't just inherit the things that you would physically identify, but you would inherit certain patterns of consciousness. You would be playing in the playground of certain patterns of consciousness. And so families too tend to be grouped by the patterns of consciousness that they are exploring or playing with. And so the family, well, it's not just blood bonds, but you are bonded by, let's say, your intention to play with certain themes, to play with certain patterns of consciousness. And so that would be important to understand. So your family is family by blood, genetically, physically related, but you are bound by, let's say, the playground of consciousness that you are undertaking to explore. And of course, in families, yes, we tend to be similar to our family members, but also quite different. And it means that we are, let's say, perhaps taking different approaches to the theme in question that we are exploring. And so that's often the reason why we have, let's say, conflict in family, in that we are collectively as a family exploring a certain theme, but different people in that family have different ways of exploring. But nonetheless, as a unit, you are, let's say, exploring a certain theme or themes. You're paying attention to particular themes to explore in the lifetime that you've been given. And so karma, generational karma, well, this idea, this notion, as we said, of inheriting the patterns of consciousness of your ancestors, but not just inheriting them in a sort of random way, but we're now talking about the more intentional choice on the soul level to play with, to take on the imprints of certain patterns of consciousness. So there's a reason why, in the first place, if you are seeing certain themes play themselves out generationally in your own family, there's a reason why you yourself have come in to take on some of that karma. So you would go into a family, you would come into a physical family that, let's say, has within it, held in its genetic line, it has some of the issues and the very problems that you are attempting to resolve for yourself. And so in terms of inheriting certain tendencies, well, you are doing that in order to take them on, to play with them in your own way. And so your family would give you, let's say, the raw material, the genetic, energetic raw material for you to take on, play with as you please. So my soul has a very intentional reason and purpose for coming into my family line, where I am provided with the very genetic material on the physical plane that's going to allow me to play out certain lessons of consciousness while I am in physical reality. And so, yes, patterns repeat themselves through generations because you're bound by, let's say, this genetic material, which is physical and non-physical. So there is a continuity of consciousness, but you are playing with certain themes generationally that hopefully each generation would sort of improve upon what the past would have done or accomplished. And so you come into a family line to, as we said, play with certain themes, but to add your own inflection onto that theme. So the point that we want to make is that while you play with the raw material, you inherit certain raw material physically and in consciousness through a decision to be within your family line on the soul level, coming into a specific biological line. While you do inherit certain things, what we want to emphasize is that you're not at all bound by the same choices that your ancestors would have made. And so the point is, well, you take on the karma of the family relative to your own beliefs. And so if you are repeating certain generational karma and certain themes become, let's say, recurring decimals in your own life, it would be an invitation to look at, well, what beliefs do I hold in my current now that would resemble some of the beliefs that my ancestors would have had. And so if you find yourself repeating the same mistakes of previous generations, if you find that there are recurring decimals, it means that, well, you are invited to look at how your beliefs are, let's say, similar to the beliefs of those who came before. And so what you're really healing is the consciousness. And so there is a continuity of consciousness that would occur sometimes for the better, meaning that you have access to certain skill sets, certain talents and gifts that would be held in your genetic line. So you inherit too, not just the negative, so to speak, tendencies, the problematic tendencies, but you would inherit, according to, let's say, the soul's plan, you would inherit you would incarnate, come into a family that would already have at its disposal genetically, because, let's say, certain characteristics are written into the very biology. You would come into a family where you have access to the skill sets and talents that are already held within that biological line. And so they are written into those skill sets and talents and gifts are written into your software as you come into a biological body. So you're able to activate with more ease the potentials that have been encoded in your genetic line if they have use for you in terms of what your soul's intentions are for your lifetime. And so you would inherit good things, good tendencies that are uplifting, things that would be read as talents and skill sets and gifts. But equally, you inherit the things that you need to heal, things that on a soul level you have signed up to address and to deal with. And so if you find that, well, you are repeating certain negative patterning, certain limiting consciousness that would manifest as problematic issues in your own life, you want to say to yourself, oh, well, what beliefs am I holding in my current now? So I'm bound to my ancestors and who came before by the same quality of consciousness that they were trying to heal but perhaps were not successful at. And so you now, in your current now, have the opportunity to, let's say, from your point of now, from your state as an independent sovereign consciousness in your current now, the point of power being your current now, you have the opportunity to say, well, how can I do things differently? And so I'm only bound to my generational karma to the extent that I hold similar patterns of consciousness and beliefs. And so if I want to change the template of consciousness, the energy template, to begin to create new things in my physical reality that depart from the past, well, I'm going to have to look at those beliefs that I have. And so, friends, you're not cursed by your generational karma. It sets up, the karma would set up, give you the raw material to deal with as you play as a soul in your physical life. It would give you some raw material. So if you have something to heal, meaning if you are invested in, if the soul is invested in healing a particular pattern, well, you're going to have to deal with the raw material of that pattern. You're going to take on, as you come into physical reality, you're going to take on that pattern to be able to address it. So you would take on the clay, the raw material of the patterns in your biological line. You would take them on as you come into a physical body, as you incarnate into your physical vehicle. You would take on the patterns held inside your biological line. You would take on the raw material, but you're meant to mold it, mold your own clay. And so it's sort of it might sound a bit paradoxical in one sense. You take it on, you take on the karma, so to speak, but you take it on, you bring it onto yourself in order for you to play with the raw material, to transmute it, to heal it, to release it. And so if certain patterns are following you around that are linked to what is in your genetic line, oh, granddad had this issue, his father had that issue, all of that, it means that there is a recurring belief in your family line that you are working toward healing, collectively speaking. And so the victories that you gain in your current now are going to reverberate backward. In other words, as your ancestors live inside you, because their genetic material can be found within you, traces of their consciousness can be found within you in your current now, encoded into the fabric of your very biology. As you heal in your current now, it means that, well, you're changing the very template, not just for generations to come, but backward, so to speak, along the timeline, in the past. You're rewriting the software of your consciousness, which means that you are rewriting the software of your biology, because biology reflects consciousness. Remember that. And so you would come into a biological line that would be, let's say, reflections to some degree of your own consciousness, reflections of some patterns of your consciousness. And many of you have been coming into your family genetic lines precisely with the intent of changing up the pattern, meaning that your soul would be carrying in a different frequency of consciousness to that which came before, in order to change the template. So you're coming into the human system and coming into a family line in order to repattern the consciousness, coming in with your own strong quality of consciousness that you're going to use to deal with, to transmute, to heal the patterns that would have come before. And so you are invested very specifically in a project of generational healing. You're coming into a family line to introduce your quality of consciousness into that family line in order to transmute and transform the biological, energetic, genetic template. And so you're coming into the system in order to play a far greater role in terms of, let's say, repatterning certain frequencies of consciousness within the human family. And so you're dealing with all of that. And some of you have come in to definitely address the business of healing some of these patterns of consciousness that tend to repeat themselves along the line. And so what we want to emphasize then is, again, that if you seem to be followed around by generational karma that doesn't seem to go away, it's not an invitation to say, oh, well, I'm cursed by this thing that keeps following me around. I don't know how to deal with it, and therefore I'm just here to be cursed by what came before. That's not the interpretation that your soul intends for you to make. It would be instead an invitation for you to assess the beliefs that are a match to the beliefs that those in your family line held before you. It's the consciousness that's repeating itself. And again, as an independent, sovereign soul, navigating reality on your own terms, you would be charged with the task of scrutinizing and looking at your beliefs to say, well, either I have this same repeating belief. The reason why the karma is showing up again in my life is because I myself am subscribed to the beliefs of old, the beliefs held in my genetic line that themselves need healing. Beliefs are representations of consciousness, patterns of consciousness. And so if you find that certain karma tends to follow you around, it means I am subscribing to a belief held within my genetic line that I myself now am charged with the task of releasing and healing. And so if there are these recurring decimals, my family, my biological line seems to be trapped, let's say, in a cycle of financial problems. As I look through my family history, I can see this recurring cycle of consciousness that manifests itself as financial problems. If this pattern continues to show up in your own life, it would mean that the consciousness and the beliefs that lead to financial disempowerment is what needs to be addressed by you. The beliefs around my safety and security, if we're talking about financial issues, for example, a common generational theme, then beliefs about my security, my safety, consciousness around security is the deeper energetic that would be in need of healing. And so if you would be repeating these themes around financial disempowerment, for example, you would be charged with the task of looking at, examining your own consciousness, your own beliefs. The only reason that you repeat generational karma is because you are subscribed to the same patterns of consciousness, the beliefs that were held before. In other words, generational karma is of decreasing relevance to you, meaning the question of repeating the difficult patterns of the past, that is of decreasing relevance to you if you are invested in releasing the consciousness that would lead to these issues in the first place. As an independent sovereign soul consciousness coming into a body for a fresh exploration of reality, you are not bound by what would have come before. You are not limited by the parameters of consciousness of those who came before you, but as your own independent, sovereign soul consciousness, you're meant to play reality, the game of reality in your own way, to discover your own power to create new potentials. With every life, there's a new opportunity to explore the field of reality in fresh ways. And so generational karma is relevant only if you are carrying the karma, meaning if you are carrying the patterns of belief, of consciousness that came before, that are producing difficult or negative effects in your life. There are many systems of understanding that can help you to get a handle on the nature of the generational karma that you might be carrying. But these systems that give you data are meant to do just that, give you data. The data is relevant in terms of you coming into a more cognitive understanding of the problem, yes, but the work of releasing the consciousness around the issues that repeat themselves, that's your own work. So while it is helpful and important to look at the past, to see the patterns that are playing themselves out, to make the connections, that's very helpful to understand what you're dealing with. The data becomes useful if it is applied to the work of restoring and healing your consciousness in the now, so that you don't repeat the story. So it is, yes, important, very important to come into an understanding of what it is that the karma is, but that understanding of what the karma is meant to assist you. It's meant to be cognitive data to assist you in letting go of the karma, to help you to see in more objective terms what the karma is, to see it, to identify it, to look at it, and then to heal it. And then perhaps you think about, well, what legacy would you like to leave for your own descendants? You're now someone's ancestor. What legacies would you like to leave for your own descendants, for the people in the future who would call you their ancestor? What victories of consciousness are you going to incorporate into your genetic and family line, so that others down the line have access to the victories of awareness that you've gained in your current now? What is your duty, responsibility toward those down the line who will feel you within them, who will hear your voice inside of them? And so if they're going to hear your voice inside of them, well, have good things to say. Let your voice be augmenting to those who are going to need the victories in consciousness that you've earned in your now, that would be passed down and encoded in your genetic line going forward. So what we are trying to emphasize in very basic terms is that the point of power is always the current moment. That is the rich place, the dynamic and rich place from which you get to act as a sovereign consciousness, the now. The now is only constrained by the past if the consciousness of the past repeats in the now. And so to introduce a bit of an astrological perspective, for example, fourth house people would be particularly invested in the work. In other words, a strong fourth house emphasis can show to us in archetypal symbolic terms that I've come into specifically address and deal with in a strong way the patterns of consciousness in my line that came before. What footnotes will I write to these patterns of consciousness? Will I amend them? Will I amend the writing on the wall? Will I add new data? And the astrological moon itself and its configuration would also help us to understand some of the past patterns and imprints that are held within the basin of memory, which includes your family, your past, all of that. The astrological moon would help us to understand the imprints of the past that are held within your genetic memory. Imprints of consciousness that many of you would very much like to heal. And so the framework that we are suggesting here also applies to things like illness. And so historical, or let's say traditional, conventional understandings are that, my mom had this disease, or this disease runs in my family, so therefore I am predisposed to contracting that disease. I am likely to contract this illness because it runs in the family. But the illnesses themselves are physical representations of the patterns of consciousness, again, that are in need of healing. So some of you see illnesses repeating in your family and you get very fearful. Understandably so, because your physical reality is showing you a repeating theme, and you think, I might catch this disease or illness, I might get this thing. And so witnessing this repeating pattern of illness in the family makes you anxious and fearful. But the illness in the family is demonstrating in physical terms that there is a pattern of consciousness shared by a group of people who have blood bonds. That there is a collective pattern of consciousness that is shared by the family collective that is in need of healing and release. And so illnesses, friends, are not separate from your consciousness. Many of us would be afraid of the diseases that run in the family because we have not made the connection between the interior, inner workings of our consciousness and the outward manifestation of them in the body. Meaning, many of us continue to be in fear because we don't see the connecting line, which has to do with our own complex of emotions, attitudes, thoughts, beliefs that impact the state of our physical health. So your personal connection to illnesses that run in the family would be the state of your own consciousness and your beliefs. The thing that would connect you to a repeating pattern in the family which manifests as a health issue, the thing that would connect you to that would be the state of your own consciousness. Meaning, I am continuing a pattern of consciousness that is held within my family of origin, genetic line. How do I address the business of repatterning that consciousness so that I'm not a match to the illnesses that are reflections of that old consciousness? And so for those of you who would be, let's say, particularly afraid of contracting certain illnesses in the family line, it would be helpful to begin to reinforce the notion that I'm not inherently bound by the family, meaning that I am my own sovereign consciousness coming into explore reality on my own terms. And so just the very act of breaking up the connection between your personal reality and the reality of your ancestors, those who came before, meaning if there are patterns that you don't want to repeat, you're not bound to repeating them. So it might do some of you some good to rewrite the program which says, this appears in my family, so I am bound to get this. That itself is a suggestion, a hypnotic suggestion that you are free to accept or reject. Not every attempt at hypnosis must be acquiesced to or accepted. And so when you tell yourself that, or you're told that because you have this illness which shows up in your genetic line, and that you're bound to yourself manifest that illness in your own life, you want to at least interrogate the premise of that suggestion for yourself. Now, there are, of course, valid reasons why a soul would decide to take on illness, that the illness would serve some deeper spiritual purposes that can be accomplished and achieved through that physical experience. And so the soul coming in would come into a line, a genetic line, which is predisposed by the nature of the imprints of consciousness running through it. The line is predisposed to certain illnesses. And so the soul might, for very good reasons, take on illnesses to be able to move through some of the patterns and the miasma and the debris that needs to be transmuted and transformed. So there are always deeper soul purposes to consider and to be aware of, indeed. But what we're calling attention to is the notion that the illnesses that show up in the body within families, well, they are reflections of consciousness. And so if they are reflections of consciousness, attention to the nearest thing to you, your own consciousness, attention to your own consciousness and what goes into it, using your conscious mind in its proper application to look at your own mind. Humans would have a unique capacity for self-reflection. And that is the height of awareness, meaning, let's say, spiritual awareness would be being aware of what you think as you are thinking it. Yes? And so the conscious mind is perfectly capable of looking at the landscape of the beliefs that program the body to act in certain ways. And so if the illness patterns running through the family have to do with the nature of the consciousness that runs through the family, then attention to your own consciousness as a part of that unit, family unit, would be something to aspire to. What is going into my consciousness? Because what goes into my consciousness comes through my body. Decide if you want to be the recipient of everything that's held in your genetic line. What things do I want? What things do I want to heal? What skill sets will I take? What patterns will I heal? What am I really available for? Am I available for this cyclical repeating, repetition of the old? Or am I going to take up the mantle of my own consciousness and create something new that can benefit those to come? So, a few things to think about. Alright, so reminding you as usual that I'm available for a range of private counseling, astrological counseling, teaching consultations and packages, and links to that are in the description box below, where you'll also find links to join my email list if you'd like these and other reflections to be sent to your inbox. So until next time, talk soon. Bye.